Welcome to Southern Maryland Perspectives. My name is Brad Gottfried, and I'm the president of the College of Southern Maryland. This is a talk show that features timely topics and guests from around the region. Well, I know it is only, actually, we're in June now, but next month, in July, we will be kicking off our Chautauqua 2017 series. And for those of you who have participated, we bring in 3 actors who portray historical figures. In this case, we're celebrating the centennial of World War I. So this is Voices from the Great War. And we're going to have General John Pershing. We're going to have Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And we're going to have President Woodrow Wilson on succeeding nights. And the first one is going to be on Tuesday, July 11th at 6:45. Remember, they're free. Bring a lounge chair. It's out in the open. We'll have a tent, and it starts off with music, and it's a great activity. And hopefully, I mentioned it was free. With me today is our first actor, and his name is Doug Mishler. He is going to be performing General John Pershing. And I have him on the line today. We're going to talk about Chautauqua. We're going to talk about General Pershing, and we're going to talk about a number of other things as well. So, Doug, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much. Always start off with the same question, Doug. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background?
Well, I've been doing Chautauqua since about 1993, and do a variety of characters. I'm at the 23 different characters now. It's amazing.
Wow.
But I teach history, actually, at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Mm-hmm.
I have been doing that since, I think, 2000, really. And so, yeah, I am academic in part, but I also do a lot of theater, run my own theater company, and direct a lot of plays and act in Reno, Nevada.
Well, now, how did you get... So have you been doing... I mean, are there other Chautauquas around the country, or mainly this one?
Yeah, they're all over the place. Oklahoma has a big one. Ohio has a big one. And then go for multiple weeks, like Maryland does, though they move week to week to week as a group, basically. But very different. But there are many individual Chautauquas. There's a big one in Reno, Nevada. We have one. There's one in Grand Junction, Colorado. There's one in Greeley, Colorado. There's one in South Carolina.
Oh, wow. Okay.
There's several in Kansas. So they're all over the place.
And are they mainly in the summer?
They're almost all in the summer. There's several into September.
Okay.
Because in several of the places, it's just too hot. There's one down in Boulder City, Nevada, and it's just too hot to do it except in October. So they do theirs in October.
Now, do most do it outside, or is it a mix?
It is a mix now. Some of the places, like Oklahoma, had so much bad weather. They have 4 sites that do it, and two. I'm getting lost. 2 are indoors and 2 are outdoors.
Oh, okay.
In southern Oklahoma in the summertime, we do it outdoors, but it was 105 degrees.
Wow.
So it was pretty miserable.
Yeah.
They found, in their case, when they went indoors, their attendance grew because it was a lot cooler. And
yeah, I would think so.
Beastly out there at that time of year.
Now, obviously, I know Maryland is probably your favorite, but...
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite state or venue where you just feel that, whether it's the ambiance, it's the audiences, that you really like going to those Chautauquas?
No favorite in that regard. That would be a disservice to all of them. All of them have something unique.
Okay.
All of them have something that fascinates me about either the community or how the interaction is done. In some communities, it's amazing how important it is to their community and how they come out. In some communities, they ask tremendous amounts of questions.
Yes.
In other communities, they don't ask many questions. They really want you to just tell what you know. So It's very intriguing. There's one community where they usually focus on, they don't ask the character that much questions.
Mm-hmm.
They ask the performer that many questions when they unmask.
Okay.
So it's very fascinating. Each place is different. Each place is good. I just love doing it.
I would imagine.
And every community has been gracious and wonderful. I mean, you never know what you're going to find. In Maryland once, I had one fellow who just would not be convinced that I was no longer Jefferson Davis. And even when I took off the wig and the beard, he just kept hounding me about slavery. And and finally somebody had to step in and ask him to stop.
Wow.
So it was pretty good. It was pretty funny, actually.
Now, I'm not a performer, but I do give lectures, and I find that when I don't get any responses in terms of questions from the audience, I always feel that I haven't done a very good job. Are you thinking that it's more cultural, or do you have that same feeling that your performance really hasn't generated the kind of excitement that you would have liked?
Well, sometimes it's not excitement. As one person told me, they said, well, you really, really answered all the main questions we thought of about the character.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you have to leave things out.
Okay.
You don't want to complete the circle in a way. You don't want to tell them everything so that when you're done, they have no room for questions.
Certainly.
But I think also sometimes you have to help them get started. You really have to have a way of working into the questions and a real shape your presentation as well to have some ambiguity, some things that you say that have no clear answer from what you're doing.
Certainly. That makes perfect sense. Now, you've
done. It makes sense. Also, if the character is more of an enigma or more, I do Theodore Roosevelt. Well, everybody wants to ask Theodore Roosevelt a question. I do George Wallace, and famously at La Plata, I got in a confrontation with a fellow, but he was about the only one who would ask a question. It was wonderful. Don't get me wrong. It was not a bad confrontation. He wasn't going to let George Wallace go until he really got an answer.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Wonderful. That was wonderful. I remember La Plata particularly for George Wallace being put on by aggressive, wonderfully insightful questions to the discrepancies within what George Wallace said and what George Wallace did. And that was wonderful because that, to me, that's the high point of Chautauqua.
Definitely, and I agree with you. I'm always impressed by the engagement of the audiences in Southern Maryland at any of all of our Chautauquas. Now, Doug, you mentioned that you've portrayed many characters in Chautauqua. Do you have a favorite?
I have a pat answer for this now. It's a two-part answer, but it's really simple. My favorite is the one I am performing at that moment. I love all of them.
Okay.
I find them interesting. Some are not the nicest people in the world, but that's what I enjoy about that, the challenge to make the world see how they saw the world.
Okay.
And maybe it's not quite proper. But I love them all, and each one offers a challenge. But I often say, now the better question for me is, if you could only do one character one more time, somebody told you you had to choose one, it has to be one, which one would you do?
Okay.
And to me, it would always be Theodore, because Theodore Roosevelt is the most complex character I have. He can speak about anything. He is fun to be around. His energy, his enthusiasm, his insights into everything you can imagine is always wonderful. Plus, my last talk could go on for forever because he wrote 36 books and hundreds of thousands of letters, and he had an opinion on everything. Somebody once called me and said, hey, can you do Theodore Roosevelt on farming? And I went, farming? And I went and researched it a little bit and found I could do one show on farming and Theodore Roosevelt.
Wow.
I was stunned that he had written so much on farming and the farmer in American culture.
Wow. Now
that's who he was.
Yeah. Now, someone like Theodore Roosevelt does not have the same controversial life as a George Wallace or
Right.
Jefferson Davis. So when you craft your presentation, do you try to intentionally be provocative, or is there a certain angle you'll take when there is indeed someone who may be a little bit off of the mainstream?
Well, what I try to do is be true to the characters. I don't make up anything. I stay within what I have of written text, what we have as actual proof, and stay within that. But I do try to craft it to make sure that I do Henry Ford and I blurt out his anti-Semitism and his paranoia. You get it in little doses as we go along.
Okay.
With George Wallace, I really start with he's remembering, and then he talks about his segregation speech. And then you go back and understand his past and what got him to that speech. And you see a much more complex picture of George Wallace. So I don't intentionally try to be provocative, but I think the characters are provocative. Good characters have a good, strong story, and often they're flawed, and that makes a wonderful story. With Jefferson Davis, I really just go with his passionate belief that he was right. He wasn't that the South had been attacked by the North, and that was all there was for him, and that he was doing what he had to do to protect his home, his family, his way of life. And he does it very passionately with very much the legalese, because it was, of course, supported with constitutional premises, the amendments, the right to property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's some horrible things within that, but in his mind, from what the country had set up to that point, he was correct. And so he stays with that, and it brings up wonderful questions about the law, our Constitution, the rights of states versus the federal government. How do we handle these kinds of transformative situations when something that used to be accepted is now rejected? And as I try to say to my students in class, try to think of the pain for white Southerners, not that you need to agree with it, but just sympathize with the fact that their world is going to change. And anytime you change someone's world, there is tremendous stress out of that. Even if they want to change, they're going to go through tremendous stress.
I see. Now, again, you've portrayed many characters.
Yep.
Have there been some that you really have, I don't want to say struggled with, and not philosophically, but that have been more difficult to portray than others?
Yeah, there have been some. Upton Sinclair that I did for Maryland many years ago, that was difficult for me. It was hard to find, what I always call it's a theater term, but it's the spine to the character. What makes them tick? What makes their story make sense? George Wallace was a little bit of that. Upton Sinclair, a bit of that. I'm doing another character soon called Judge Isaac Parker. He was the famous hanging judge from the Oklahoma Indian Territory. He was in charge of the wildest, nastiest area in the United States, filled with vermin. And he was charged with very little help of cleaning that up. And he gets a reputation for hanging men. And I've struggled with how to get into him. I think I have figured out the way to access it to make it a little bit dramatic, because it's pretty simple. Ultimately, he saw there were evil men. He gave them a trial. They were arrested. There were witnesses and that. And if they were found guilty of murder, the ultimate penalty, it was a federal law at the time, was death. He had no choice in it. There was only one thing you could do, and if it was murder, it had to be a death penalty. So he hung quite a few men, about 72 men, over a 20-year period.
Wow.
But they were all pretty bad people.
Sounds that way.
The list of the miscreants he was involved with are just amazing. But I had to struggle a little bit to find the access in, and the access in became that his legal decisions quickly became challenged in the last 5 years of his term in office because the country had changed and how it viewed criminals and how it viewed the death penalty, and the Supreme Court started to overturn his decisions, the jury's decisions, because of technicalities, what he felt were technicalities. And so he starts to lose control of himself. He becomes enraged by the Supreme Court. So sometimes there are problems. Others are easy. I just did Nikita Khrushchev. I started him last summer, which was so much fun. I enjoyed it so much being Nikita Khrushchev, and people loved Nikita Khrushchev, believe it or not. I couldn't believe how Americans, I was in Oklahoma, loved Nikita Khrushchev.
Really?
Yeah, oh, it was amazing. Well, he turns out he's way more funny and earthy than you would have thought. A little bit like Lyndon Johnson. He loves to tell stories. He was self-deprecating, and the Americans never trusted him, so they didn't get when he said, we don't have an agricultural system. It's more insanity. He was serious, and they thought he was faking, but he said, no, we're serious. He was serious. Wow. And so he had wonderful stories, and he was easy to get into because I just framed it around the Cold War and his view of telling the American people how they were wrong, that it was really the United States' fault for the Cold War. And it brought up some interesting things about the United States. The Soviet Union never killed and replaced leaders they didn't agree with. The United States did that. I mean, they did a couple in Eastern Europe, but that was a kind of a different motive behind it. And so it was fascinating how people reacted to it, looking at it and saying, maybe there was a misunderstanding on both sides, and also how close we came to, first of all, Armageddon, but second of all, how we might have come, had Kennedy not been killed, might have come to a place where we could have gotten rid of nuclear weapons. Interesting. And maybe even disarmed, because he wanted it desperately because the Soviet Union was so weak. But anyway, each character offers differences. Some are hard to figure out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
And definitely we're going to talk about General Pershing, but let me just mention to the listeners, I'm with Doug Mishler, a Chautauqua historian, a faculty member, a Chautauqua performer. He'll be at the College of Southern Maryland to kick off the 2017 Chautauqua series, and he will be portraying General John Pershing. This is all about the Great War as we celebrate its centennial. Tuesday, July the 11th at 6:45, and free. Bring a lawn chair and come prepared to have a great time. Now, Doug, you mentioned, trying to find that hook, that way in, so to speak. What are you going to be doing with General Pershing? How are you going to approach him?
Well, and I was really at a loss at first. He was another one I struggled with a little bit, and a lot of times it just takes me reading over my notes over and over and over again, and then slowly getting an idea of how I'll shape him. But I know clearly a lot will have to be said about the war, because that is the main point.
Yes.
But, of course, it only occupies about a year and a half of his rather distinguished service and his complex life. So I'm probably going to have him set up after the war, probably in the late 30s, just before the war starts, the Second World War starts. So he can look back and talk about how the world has changed and what the Great War, quote unquote, meant. And then get into the war, but also talk about, famously he chased Pancho Villa across Mexico for a while.
Right.
Most people don't know that he served with Theodore Roosevelt, became a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, has a wonderful story about meeting Theodore Roosevelt for the first time. It's a great story. He had served in Cuba with Theodore Roosevelt, or beside Theodore Roosevelt, and served for a very long time in the Philippines, trying to put down the Filipino insurrection with the Moros and others in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he also, for a brief time, at the very end, served within the army fighting the Indians in the plains. At the very end of that,
Yeah, at the very beginning of his career, yes. Now,
right, and that's where some people say he got the name Black Jack Pershing, because he led black cavalry units in the West. So he has this wide-ranging career. So we'll talk about that in a bit.
Okay.
But mainly focus on the amazing thing that he pulled off in World War I. Amazing in that no one had ever put together. The United States was totally unequipped for this modern war, and how to handle the sheer logistics of moving 2 million men across the ocean and sending them into combat, and how do you organize it. One of the wonderful points is it's so much more complex. In the Civil War, the largest unit that Grant ever controlled was 140,000 men.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that wasn't even a good offensive in World War I. He had 2 million men.
Wow.
He had tremendous. When they moved to do the Somme, I was just looking at the statistic. They had to move the army up the road, and they're going to go with 3,000 pieces of artillery, 40,000 tons of ammunition. I think the largest artillery battle was at Gettysburg in the Civil War, and it was only 300 guns on each side. It's just the staggering size of it, and the amount of logistics. When they moved the army in the Meuse-Argonne, to move it just a few miles up the road, they had to build 80 new supply depots, 44 hospitals, rail lines, and then and a new airfield, all before they could attack. And they did all this in about a 2-week period. It's just staggering what they had to face. Now, and so it's a whole new war. And though there are many that disdain he was a little slow on some of the pickup that the war had changed. But he did understand that the war was a far, far different war in the sense of logistics and just how a general would man and control troops. There wasn't any more, as he said, there's no more Stonewall Jackson at the front of his troops, waving his flag, charging the men on. It was much more complex than that. The general had to be back and making sure everybody moved at the same time, and the coordination of artillery and air power and tanks. And
now, as you mentioned, Doug, very unusual for someone to command such a large body of men, but also the intricacies of working with allies, the French and the British, and apparently
that is one that I really am going to enjoy doing, because
they didn't get along very well, or they didn't agree.
Along very well at all. They did it. Certain people got along with certain people, but of course, by the time the United States arrives, the war has been going on for years, and the English and French and the Germans are really exhausted. And the French are almost in mutiny and near collapse. The English follow within months of getting almost near collapse. And so they push a plan called amalgamation, the idea that the United States troops would go in to the battle, but they would just be put into the lines with with English or French troops. They would just be replacements, put it that way.
Right.
And, of course, one of the great services that Pershing does to the United States is just to be adamantly resistant. At one point, he tells the French commander, and the French commander says, are you against this? And he said, we will go in wherever you direct, and we will do whatever you want, but we will go in under American flags and American officers.
And he stuck to his guns.
You can assign us to whatever you want and tell us to do whatever you want, but we will do it as Americans. And so he was he got in a lot of trouble over this. Well, not great trouble. They sent someone out from Washington to try to ameliorate the problem, because the king was telling Wilson that, Pershing was insane and incompetent. And when they got there, after one meeting, they basically told Pershing, no, we support you 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the amalgamation kept pushing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as he once said to them, he was furious in one of the meetings, and he said, gentlemen, I have thought this through very deliberately, and I will not be coerced.
Mm-hmm.
And so he did keep it together as an American army, that's one of the great legacies, and also one of the great, probably a turning point for the war, because it is this fresh, new army with officers that aren't, burned out by years and years and years of conflict. They still have that American esprit de corps. As one French officer says to a Marine captain, they said, you have lost many men. Are you going to retreat? And he said, even if we come down to 4 different men, we will be, echeloned in force, and we will continue to go forward. And that was one of the big differences, that the American officers and the American men were not worn out. And as this single powerful force that was unleashed, even the Germans admitted that changed everything. Mm-hmm. And maybe it would not have been that way had they been under French or British command, since the French and British command was as worn out as their men were.
We just have a few more minutes, Doug, but do you think you would have liked him personally?
I don't know. The thing about him, and that's going to be the difficulty to get across, he had friends, and his close friends, he was gregarious and open, and he laughed, and he drank, and in his early years played poker with them. But when you weren't his friend, after his wife died, he never really made close friends again. Mm-hmm. They were only old friends. And he also, in military, they always talk about him as being, he's cold, he is impersonal. Mm-hmm. Now, he does this to protect himself and to get the best out of his men. He doesn't play personalities. He doesn't play favorites. He expects, he's rigorously strong and orderly, very military-bearing. Some people saw him as a martinet, especially people that didn't know him. But that's the hard part. How do you get this across that there's two different John Pershings? There's the one who is often seen as cold and uncaring, and there's the other Pershing who cries often after visiting the men, the troops in the hospitals, and who has doubts, and who is warm and friendly and funny. But when he's not with his best friends, he is tough and hard.
Mm. Now, after
so that's going to be. Yeah. That's why I want to put him after the war, so he can take off some of that military bearing, mm-hmm. and show that human side to him, and then cut back to the tough, hard, stern leader. Mm-hmm. That never showed it. He said, as a leader, you can never show despair. You can never show doubt. You can never show that you're upset. Mm-hmm. You must just keep going and mm-hmm. demand the best.
Well, it will be a fascinating portrayal. We are certainly looking forward to it. I want to, again, tell the listeners to come out on Tuesday, July the 11th at 6:45 to see Doug Mishler, who will be portraying General Blackjack John Pershing. College of Southern Maryland, La Plata campus, bring a lounge chair, bring your family, we'll be under the tent, and it's a great way to spend a summer evening. On the 12th is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and on Thursday, July 13th, is President Woodrow Wilson. Doug Mishler, thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to meeting you when you're on campus on the 11th.
I look forward to it. It's going to be a wonderful week, I'm sure.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the listeners for tuning in. and I hope you'll join me next week for another edition of Southern Maryland Perspectives. Until that time, I'm Brad Gottfried, president of the College of Southern Maryland.